Here in Tutorial 5, we're going to officially switch roles. In Tutorials 1 through 4, we were users with some designer capabilities. Starting in Tutorial 5, we learned to become designers. Our objectives for this tutorial are to review table and object naming standards. That's our three-letter naming prefix, TBL, QRY, FRM, RPT. We're going to use operators like, in, not. We're going to use an auto filter to filter data. Later on, we'll actually learn how to save those as queries. We're going to learn to use the if function. In Access, we use the immediate if, which is an IIF rather than if, but they work in the same way. What we have to understand is when we're writing queries or writing calculations in Access, we have to use IIF, the immediate if, not the if. We're going to learn to write a parameter query where we can pass a value to a query. We're going to use query wizards to write a crosstab query, a find duplicates query, a find unmatched query. We're going to create a top values query that allows us to return a certain number of records. We'll modify table designs with lookup fields, input masks, and data validation rules. Although we'll be doing these in a table in Tutorial 5, we're going to be taking them out in Tutorial 6 because remember what I talked to you about in prior videos is that often in a business, the users, even advanced users, don't have access to the tables and can't make changes in the tables. So you're first going to see how to make a change in the table, and then we're going to see how to make the modifications in the forms that basically do the same things. We're going to identify object dependencies. This is helpful if we want to understand what a change to one object will do to other objects. We're going to look at using a memo field, and if you haven't already designated a trusted folder, you'll learn how to do that in this tutorial. We'll look at naming conventions, and you'll see that we'll be naming our major objects with TBL and QRY, FRM, RPT. We already started this in our Tutorial 4 homework assignment. We're going to look at using a pattern match in a query. That's a wildcard. So if we're not sure of how something is spelled, we can use a wildcard to take the place of unknown characters, or we can use a wildcard to find a string in which our desired text is contained. So it could be at the beginning, it could be at the end, it can be in the middle. We'll use an in. In works very similar to an or I can say I want Bellevue or Redmond or Issaquah or North Bend. The problem with that is that after we do a few of those, we forget to put the or in. The in allows us to do something similar, but we put in and then we put our names. In Bellevue, comma, Redmond, comma, Issaquah, comma, North Bend. So we'll learn how to use that. An in allows us to more easily negate a criteria. So instead of saying not equal to Bellevue, not equal to Redmond, not equal to Issaquah, not equal to North Bend, we can say not in Bellevue, Redmond, Issaquah, North Bend. So you'll see how powerful the in comparison operator is. I've already mentioned a little bit about the not operator, and you can see how it's used here with the list of cities. And sometimes when we're trying to select something, it's easier to tell Access what we don't want than to tell it what we do want. For example, if we wanted all of the cities in King County except Seattle, it would be quite difficult to say Issaquah or Redmond or Kirkland or Sammamish instead of going not Seattle. We'll learn to use an autofilter. Autofilter is done through Datasheet View, and you may be familiar with it from your work in Excel. And if we are asked to do the same filter over and over again, there is an option to save it as a query. We don't do that in this particular tutorial, but it is taught later on in the book. We're going to look at assigning a conditional value to a calculated field. In other words, we're going to write an immediate if. The one that is in the book is very complicated because it's teaching a number of things at the same time. All of these operators do not have to be present in the same if statement. Just the if statement that is used in the book is very complicated in order to teach a number of different things at the same time. When we do it in class, or when you see it done in the videos, I try to take it apart and do it piece by piece. Concatenating a name. This is very important to understand. In the standard English language convention, when we show that last name first, followed by the first name, there's always a comma after the last name. For example, Tudor, comma, Henry. The concatenation would be last name and, quotation mark, comma, space, quotation mark, and first name. However, when we write in standard English the first name first, there is no comma between the two names. Henry Tudor. It's first name and, quotation mark, space, quotation mark, and last name. So there is only a comma in between the two names when the last name comes first. So you need to think about how you're doing this and just don't arbitrarily throw in a comma. A parameter query is a query that allows us to pass a value to the query. For example, if we wanted to find all of our customers that live in the state of Washington, and all of our customers that live in the state of Oregon, and all of our customers that live in the state of Idaho, if we had customers that lived all over the United States, we'd have to write 50 queries, one for each group of customers. But we can also write a parameter query, and when we run it, we tell it which state we want to see in the result set. So a dialog box pops up, and we enter a value. In this case, we're looking at the city. So when the dialog box pops up, we tell it what city we want in the result set. And what we'll also learn here is that we can use a wildcard in the parameter. The quick check answers are included here, and they're also in the PowerPoint that's posted for you in the class files. We're going to take a look at a crosstab query. A crosstab query works similar to an Excel spreadsheet in that I can total down and across. When we create a crosstab query, we often create it from another query. One of the most important things that you need to understand when you're creating a crosstab query is to make sure that the query from which you are creating your crosstab query is correct. If that query is not correct, you cannot expect your crosstab query to be correct. One of the biggest mistakes students make in Tutorial 5 is that they build a crosstab query correctly on a query that is incorrect. And so the results of the crosstab query are going to be incorrect no matter what you do. So when you create a crosstab query, you think you've done it right. Instead of redoing the crosstab query, go look at the original query, the one on which it's based. Correct that query. Then when you rerun your crosstab query, the crosstab query should be correct. A find duplicates query. In this case, we're going to be using find duplicates to find customers that have more than one contract with us, or donors that have made more than one pledge. A find duplicates query is a query that you can also use when you're trying to find duplicate values in a field that you're trying to set as a primary key. It's a very quick way to find your duplicate values. The find unmatched query, in this particular case, it's going to show us customers that don't have active contracts or pledges that don't have funds. But we can also use a find unmatched query when we're trying to set referential integrity between two tables. We can use it to find those values that are in the many side of the relationship that don't have a match on the one side of the relationship. When we did this in tutorials 1 and 2, we had to do it manually by simply looking for the values. But if we're dealing with thousands of records, that wouldn't be a very effective way to do it. So our find unmatched query can do that for you very quickly. One of the things that goes wrong in tutorial 5 with the find unmatched query is naming issues within the tables. In some cases, we have fields in two tables that have the same name but do not contain related data. And so you need to be very careful of that. When you're going to relate your two tables or your table in your query, you need to make sure that you're relating two fields that contain the same data. One of the areas where people run into a problem is in the suppliers in the review exercise when you're looking for products. And instead of matching the product ID, they're matching the product type, and the product type is totally different in each table. It is not a related field. So be careful when you're doing an unmatched query to look for a related field. A top values query is just a simple way to show you certain values. It has to do with the sort. You must sort the query first, and you can sort it ascending, you can sort it descending, and the top values will pull whatever you specify from the top of the list, so that you have your salespeople with the highest amount of sales. They're going to be at the top. They'll be the ones that pulled out. If you want your lowest, you sort them ascending so that the lowest are at the top. And you can set any number. It can be a percentage or it can be an actual value. The mistake that students make here is that instead of asking for 5, they'll put in 5%, or instead of asking for 5%, they'll put in 5. So be careful of what you're asking for. Here in the return, you can use a percentage. And in other places in Access, you've seen that you can't use the percentage. And so it may not make sense to you to use it here, but you may use it here. Our quick check answers again. We're also going to be looking at lookup fields and input masks. Now, as I mentioned earlier, oftentimes we're not allowed to have access to the tables within our database. We link to the tables and we manipulate the data on our desktop. So what we're going to see in Tutorial 5 is putting lookup fields in the table. And then in Tutorial 6 we're going to pull those lookup fields out and we're going to see how to do them in the form. Because you may be able to do them in the table based on the access that you have to your data in your business or in your personal databases. If you don't have access to the table, you will have to do it in the form. And it's also recommended actually that we are doing it in the form instead of in the table. But you'll see how to do both of them. A lookup field is going to give us a drop-down list from which we can choose the entry that we want in a particular cell. This is going to help us validate our data, so that instead of typing in something and misspelling or using the wrong name, we can choose it from the drop-down list. The drop-down list can be set up in at least 2 ways. You can set it up so that a user must choose from the list, or you can set it up so that they can type in a new value. It really depends on how your tables are structured and what it is you're trying to accomplish. Within the lookup wizard, at this point, if I wanted to change the order of the fields, I could actually drag and drop these fields to different positions. Be careful when you're testing your lookup field or when you're simply working in your table. If you are testing the lookup field and you randomly select someone off this list, you have just changed the contracts so that they now belong to a new customer, or I should say a different customer. If you think that you've done that, press your escape key. Press it immediately and it will change your data back to the original values. The input mask wizard, this is going to solve some of the issues that you've had with the phone numbers and not liking the look of the phone numbers. The input mask wizard is a format basically that we're going to apply to the field so that we type in just the numbers, but when we look at it, it looks like a phone number with the parentheses and the hyphen and the space and all that. That's called an input mask. In the book, they have you remove the bang, the exclamation mark, from in front of the input mask. But what the bang does for us, and you'll see this demonstrated in the video, is that if you don't have an area code, the input mask wizard, you need to just look at this table. Mark it in your book so that you know how to know where it is, and you get back to it so that you know what the input mask characters mean. You're going to be asked to create an input mask where some of the values are optional and some are required. Required is the 0. So that just means these are required, these are not. Because the 0 entry is required, the 9 it's not. So you'll need to refer to this to make sure that you're creating your input masks correctly. Object dependencies we've seen this when we created referential integrity. tables are dependent on another table, and also when I create a query based on a table, now that query is dependent on that table. When I create a form that is dependent on the query, the form is also dependent on the table. And the object dependencies window will show us how these objects are dependent, so that if I were to change the table, I could see all of the dependent objects that would be impacted as well. Here's an example. When we're looking at the customer table, the customer is one side of the relation, and so there are no tables that are dependent on it, but there are plenty of forms, queries, and reports that are dependent on this table. Data validation roles. Data validation allows us to restrict values that can be input into a field. And we have a couple of options on this. We have field level validation rules, which are written for the field, so they're written in the field properties, and they will apply to only that field. So if I want to test the invoice amount, I write a field level validation rule. If I want to compare the values that are in two different fields in the same table, like I want to make sure, for example, that in the contract table, that the signing date of the contract is before the start date of the contract, I have to write a table level validation rule, because I can't put the validation in the field, because in that case it would only look at the values in that particular field. Table level validation is going to allow access to look at two different fields and compare them. So if you're dealing with one field, it goes in the field level. If you're dealing with more than one field, it goes in the table. Memo fields, just a long text field, and allows us to put in long character strings. There's some limitations with this. We can't use it in index, we can't use it as a primary key, but it has some value in that we can add formatting, and we can also track changes to that field. So that if we were keeping notes about a customer, we could set it up so that every time the existing note is replaced with a new one, the existing note is logged, so we can go back into the log and see the whole series of modifications or revisions. Designated a trusted folder. Once you've enabled the database from a particular folder, that database is always enabled on that PC as long as it's in the same path. But you can designate a trusted folder so that you can trust your whole 168 folder on your flash drive, or your whole 168 folder on the hard drive of your PC. It's very easy to do. Just be aware that once you trust that folder, anything that you put into that folder is trusted. And again, more quick check answers. Welcome to Tutorial 5. You are now a designer.